In this video, we'll be talking about dementia, in particular Alzheimer's disease. So by the end of this video, you should be able to explain the underlying changes that we see in the brain with Alzheimer's disease and be able to identify the main class of drugs used to treat Alzheimer's disease. So Alzheimer's disease is just one type of dementia, and it falls under this umbrella of dementia. So dementia overall is thought and behavior impairments that disrupt everyday life. Now, here I've just listed a few different types of dementia. And out of these, which ones do you think are the most common? So most of you probably got Alzheimer's disease, especially since we mentioned that that's what we're going to talk about. But most people don't necessarily pick vascular dementia. And vascular dementia is dementia related to some sort of stroke or vascular disease. Maybe you pick Parkinson's disease because we've mentioned it before and we'll come back and talk about it more. Alcohol related because we've discussed Wernicke's-Korsakoff's. And we'll also probably come back and touch on that a little bit more in the class. So some of these other Lewy body disease we'll talk about when we talk about Parkinson's, and then there's others that we just don't have time to go into here. But it's important to know that 13% of adults over the age of 65 have dementia, and that after the age of 65, the number of individuals with dementia increases exponentially. So that, just basically it has to do with the plasticity of our brain, and that our brain just can't recover from the damage that accumulates. And Alzheimer's disease, of that 13% of adults, Alzheimer's disease accounts for 60% of dementia cases. Alzheimer's disease begins with a gradual progressive loss of memory. It affects 5% of people aged 65 to 74, but 50% of people over the age of 85, just to give you a little idea how exponential that growth is. It also commonly occurs in middle-aged people with Down syndrome. Neuronal loss starts in the hippocampus, but as you can see here, this is someone preclinical. This means before symptoms. There's damage to the brain before any symptoms actually occur. And this is something we'll also see when we talk about Parkinson's disease. In particular, we see damage to acetylcholine-producing neurons. And we'll come back and talk about this. If we have damage to acetylcholine-producing neurons, what do you think we want to do to treat those first symptoms of Alzheimer's disease? And we'll come back to that in a few moments. And also, if neuronal loss is occurring in the hippocampus, what did we talk about in the previous video with HM? What type of memory do you think is going to be lost first? We had procedural, episodic, or semantic. Episodic, because we said that the hippocampus is really, or those episodic memories are really dependent on that hippocampus. Also, because we're also seeing some damage here in the temporal lobe, we're also going to see at first some semantic memory loss as well. Now, over time, as you see here, as we get into mild to moderate and then move into severe Alzheimer's disease, cell loss spreads to other cortical regions. And so there'll be other symptoms besides just that loss of declarative memory, such as impairments in reasoning, attention, language, performing simple tasks. And by the end, people with Alzheimer's disease, unfortunately, are bedridden and are unable to care for themselves. Here's just showing you what a healthy brain looks like and what a brain with severe Alzheimer's looks like. And you can see it with all the shrinkage, just shows you how much cell loss there is with Alzheimer's disease. So the next question is, what causes this cell loss? Although we can't know for sure, most scientists think that it's caused by an accumulation and clumping of brain proteins. One of these in particular is amyloid beta protein. Now, we aren't going to go through all the details of what happens in this class, but it appears as if accumulation starts before people have symptoms, perhaps years before people have symptoms. And basically what happens is it forms plaques outside the neuron. So when you hear the word amyloid beta, think plaques. So amyloid plaques in Alzheimer's disease. And you can see here, here's a healthy neuron, and here are the synapses out here, connections to other neurons, and here's what a diseased neuron looks like. And this is an accumulation and a clumping of this amyloid plaque. And this causes inflammation. And so where these plaques are accumulating is in that synapse. And so think about it. If you have neurotransmitters are trying to go across that synapse and you have all this gunk in there, it's not going to be able to communicate. And so that's, again, and once the cell can't communicate, the cell will eventually die. Now, one theory is that the inability of the older brain to deal with this inflammation and clear these proteins is why Alzheimer's disease results. The other protein to accumulate is tau protein. Now, my understanding is that the accumulation of tau protein doesn't necessarily occur until amyloid's accumulated to a certain point and what's called sometimes a tipping point. The tau protein is part of the cell's transport mechanisms. So you see here in a healthy neuron, the tau protein allows new proteins to travel down this microtubule to the correct location. So when it breaks down, as you see it breaking down here, and you have these tau tangles inside the cell, transport breaks down, and ultimately it can also kill the cell. So tau protein is going to form tangles. So you'll remember tau and tangles are associated with Alzheimer's disease and amyloid plaques. Both of these are very characteristic of Alzheimer's disease, and you have groups that are focused their research on amyloid beta. You have groups that are focusing their research on tau protein, and it's kind of this. It's always been this kind of battle of which one is more important. It seems to be more of an understanding now, like I said, that the amyloid beta accumulates first, and then it hits a tipping point when the tau tangles start to form. There's also another big push looking at this idea of inflammation and why can't people with Alzheimer's disease clear these accumulating proteins from the brain and then reduce that inflammation. Here's just a diagram showing you again those amyloid plaques and those tau tangles at the microscopic level. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the risk factors for developing Alzheimer's disease. And age is probably the single greatest factor. And unfortunately, there's really nothing we can do about that. We talked about how after the age of 65, the risk of dementia increases exponentially. Genetics is also important, but probably accounts for less than 1% of cases. Genes have been identified, and they increase the risk, but they don't predetermine that you're going to get Alzheimer's disease. Much like the breast cancer gene increases the risk for breast cancer, it doesn't say that you're for sure going to get it. And a lot of times these genes like ApoE4, presenilin 1 and 2, APP, which are found on chromosome 21, which is why people with Down syndrome are more likely to get it, has to do with the early onset of Alzheimer's disease, which is occurring before the age of 50 or 60, versus late onset, which is after the age of 65, when we see this exponential increase. And I bring this up because we'll see this as a trend with other diseases and disorders like Parkinson's disease. Other risk factors include head injury, and that is something that we can control. We can control wearing a bike helmet when we're riding our bikes. We can control the amount of contact sports we play and using proper equipment to protect our heads. Sleep is also another one that has been shown to be related with increased risk for Alzheimer's disease. People that sleep 6 or less hours per night are more likely to get it. And it may have to do with during slow wave sleep, we see that restoration, one of those theories that was discussed, right? And that there's actually a clearing out of kind of what I'll call my non-scientific term, gunk from the brain while we sleep during that slow wave sleep. And that if you're sleeping less than 6 hours per night, you're not getting that clearance. And so over time, then these proteins accumulate and cause damage to the neurons. Heart health is another one. And again, you see all three of these we actually do have some control over. Things that affect your cardiovascular health, like diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, those can all impact your risk for AD. And those are all things that we can control with diet and exercise. Now we're going to talk a little bit about Alzheimer's disease treatments. And unfortunately, there is no known cure. Every so often, something will come along that seems very promising. Perhaps it looked very good in an animal trial, but then when it progresses to a clinical trial in humans, it just isn't effective. So for now, the drugs that are used to treat Alzheimer's disease are primarily there to target the symptoms. So what is the main symptom of Alzheimer's disease? Memory impairments. And again, what did we say was a neurotransmitter? What neurotransmitter? What in the hippocampus, those neurons are producing what neurotransmitter that were lost early on? Acetylcholine. So we want to increase acetylcholine activity, and that's what those drugs are targeting. In order to do that, we use something called cholinesterase inhibitors. So a cholinesterase inhibitor is going to improve memory impairments. And it does this by preventing the breakdown of acetylcholine. So it's important to kind of understand, if we say that early on in the progression of Alzheimer's disease, we have a loss of neurons that produce acetylcholine. That means acetylcholine neurotransmitter the amount is decreasing in the brain of these people with Alzheimer's disease, specifically in the hippocampus. We want to improve memory impairments by increasing that amount of acetylcholine. And one way to do that is to prevent that breakdown. Remember, when we talked earlier in the semester, I said it was important to understand what happens with the neurotransmitter after it does its job. Enzymatic breakdown was one thing, reuptake was the other. So here's with no drug. So here you have, this is our presynaptic neuron, this is our postsynaptic neuron, these are our receptors embedded in the membranes, here are synaptic vesicles, and the red dots represent the neurotransmitter, and we have some acetylcholine here, and then acetylcholinesterase breaks it down into choline and acetate, and it's no longer an effective neurotransmitter. Now, if we give a cholinesterase inhibitor to someone, this breakdown, it's inhibiting this enzyme. We no longer have this breakdown, and you can see we now have more neurotransmitter in the synapse. So next you're going to watch a video that talks about a new non-invasive treatment that has been found to be very promising in mice, and it decreases the amyloid plaques and tau tangles in these mice with a combination of a 40 hertz sound and a strobing light. And so